Welcome to Learning cEDH, the podcast dedicated to teaching you everything you know. God dang it. Podcast.
You got to add that in.
The podcast dedicated to teaching you everything you need to know about competitive Commander. I'm Matthew, and as always, I'm joined by my co-host Eric. And today we are going to be talking about politics, threat assessment, all the little annoyances that come up in online discussion about bad plays or good plays and Jedi mind tricks, all of that nonsense.
Yeah, we're pretty excited to bring this topic today. I think it's just good, especially for new players, to come in to understand the game and the entire dynamics that aren't just, casting your spells and, demonic consultationing with Thassa's Oracle in the play. There's a lot more that goes into it.
Yeah, I definitely think it's something that when you're first coming in, you'll kind of hear just the term thrown around of like politics, king making, stuff like that, and not even necessarily have it explained to you. And especially like threat assessment, you'll hear people just say, well, that's bad threat assessment. Like I was asking questions about what would you like me to address in this video, and people would just say bad threat assessment with no explanation of what bad threat assessment, because it's like that can be different depending on a lot of different factors. We're playing a game with there's a ton of unknown information, so I think it's gonna be hopefully helpful to at least have somebody try to explain what they mean when they say bad threat assessment.
So bad threat assessment, it's interesting because not only are you going like an end game like situation, but every player there has had their own experiences. So what one bad threat assessment might be for one player, it may not quite be the same from other players, especially coming back if they're coming from like Commander as their background and maybe not necessarily a competitive background. Or I think it's fair to say that anybody who sees Heuristic Study kind of just understands how powerful that card is in any format.
You'd be surprised, apparently.
Well, I probably would be, but there's a multitude of factors that go into like people's different experiences for threat assessment. And I just think that's why having like an open discussion about it, or even like a post-game discussion about it, can really advance players to just understanding. And I think it too helps them understand how cards work in a particular situation.
We're going to get into all of that and more real quick. We'll do a little bit of housekeeping stuff. You may have heard me mention before about this tournament that's going on in Portugal that's being run by the cEDH Portuguese League. This is their 10th event. It's going to be taking place in Lisbon. It's going to be really big. They've got over $2,000 in prizes. It's going to be taking place May 5th, 6th, and 7th. And yeah, there's going to be information for that in the description below. That'll send you to their pages and their Discord. They're being sponsored by Card Market, Alter Sleeves, a bunch of other good companies. So yeah, if you're in the area, which unfortunately I will not be, good luck to all the players who will be there, but I will not be, unfortunately. If you can make it, definitely go over there. Anytime you can go to like a big cEDH event, it's sure to be a great time. Make your way over there. Also, a quick shout out to all of my patrons over on Patreon for Lemora's cards, especially to big $10 patrons, LF Cruz, Neo Venus, and Defcat. Thank you so much. All of your support over there helps the channel get to do all the things that it gets to do very directly. And that is the same with my merch. As you can see, since we have face cams now, Eric wearing the Corvold shirt. We've also got the popular Stacks the Anime shirt, the Gila, all kinds of good merch over there, so definitely check that out. And for the next, I think 2 weeks, there will be 10% off with promo code Lemora, so you can get a discount over there. Definitely check that out. All those links in the description below. And I think with that, we are ready to hop into all these hot takes with politics.
The hottest takes,
So I think the first thing we can start with, and I think depending on where you come into cEDH from, that'll change your pre-existing understanding of what politics and Magic is. Because if you're coming from casual Commander, you've already experienced it. That's like a huge thing in casual Commander games, just as it is in cEDH. Because this is, if you've seen some of my older content, you'll know that I talk about how like Commander is not a casual format, but I think it is absolutely, without question, it is a social game. There is a lot of social elements that goes into it, and trying to, may sound like a, not trying to make it have a negative connotation here, but trying to manipulate these situations to benefit you more than it benefits other players by either directing the table's attention towards certain threats, or directing it away from you in general, or obscuring some amount of information. any kind of play that you make that takes into consideration how the table is going to react.
Yeah. And I really think that a big part of that comes from actually understanding the decks and what the cards do. Particularly, we all know, we've already just said Rhystic Study as an example, but we all know what like Rhystic Study does. We know what Mystic Lemora does. We know what Esper Sentinel does. For those, for example, so like seeing those kind of early in the game, you have a pretty good grasp if you've played with or against those cards, how powerful an impact they could be. Or if a Carpet of Flowers comes down and you've got a lot of people playing islands in your pod, of just how much like mana advantage that's going to give a player. So just understanding those cards contextually based on the situation of the game and the pod composition, and potentially turn order too, and the decks that they're being played in. Once those come into play, players are going to kind of maneuver and, you know, make comments or discuss things based on the game. I feel like the game also too, outside of something absolutely crazy early in the game, everybody kind of does their building phase where they like build the first couple of turns and then the game really starts.
And that's like casual Commander for the most part. It takes place over more turns. You know, usually in like casual Commander, building out might be like 3 to 4 turns before people really start doing stuff where they're just casting rocks and cultivates and stuff like that. A lot of that gets condensed into like the first turn or 2 in a game of cEDH because you have a bunch of mana positive stuff. It's a lot easier to develop, though there is still interaction in that. I think that's one of the key differences is like there's very little interaction in like a casual game during that sort of setup phase. Whereas like if you play a turn 1 Mystic Remora or an Esper Sentinel as part of your card advantage development, that is likely to eat up some sort of interaction because that, while everybody is developing, a card like Esper Sentinel gets to draw a ton of cards off of that development because it's likely to include non-creature spells.
And then people get to, sorry to cut you off, but we get access to, well, everyone has access to this card, but like Mental Misstep, that's just free equity that you're leaving on the table by not casting in particular in that position. Especially, that's the difference between like casual is they may not be playing a card like that, but being able to use Life as a Resource, 0 mana to stop that from happening, you're going to probably make that play 99% of the time outside of some unique circumstance.
Already, that sort of like early development takes into consideration, I think especially with more experienced players, that the idea that cards like that are likely to show up in opening hands, and playing around that can sometimes be worth it. Like not being the first person to play a very scary 1 drop that can get hit by misstep can sometimes be worth, especially like if you're going first, right? Because if you're on the play and you go turn 1 fish, every single person there is just like waiting. They're shaking in their hands to cast the misstep if they have it. Like, so you probably should go for it with that specific card. But for instance, like if you do a turn 1, especially if it's like an instant speed tutor, you probably shouldn't do it on the play. Like you should wait, and those instant speed tutors get interesting because you get more information anyway. So a lot of times you want to wait. Although if there's something like one of these cards that draw off of other things, like an Esper Sentinel, then it can kind of force your hand to feel like you're disadvantaged for it. As soon as somebody plays like land Mana Crypt, opposition agent, well, really as soon as somebody plays a land that taps for black, opposition agent is now on the table. So that's a consideration. So just there are a lot of different factors that can lead to you wanting to make plays that aren't necessarily, like if you're gold fishing, plays you wouldn't make. And that's a lot of the key here. And it's with things that are scarier. So like a Lemora Elves and an Esper Sentinel, they're not built the same. Now, Esper Sentinel built different. Ragavan is something you might consider misstepping depending on how developed people are getting and stuff like that. If it's a Timna deck, it's a lot better. But yeah, there's a lot of things that go into those sort of politics even early on, and especially the more resources people are working with, the closer to a win people start to get. It all starts to compound because now you might know that you're a little bit slower than maybe the person in seat 1 and 2, and you need to make sure that you can get to a point where you get to win. So even if you have the big scary thing on the board, whatever that is, you need to try to be able to direct that hate or some of that interaction towards those players. And I think it's best done when you do it in a way that doesn't just totally ignore reality, right? Good politics will probably win you. I don't have any statistics for this, so can't look it up. I guess you can't disprove me, but I think good politics could win you maybe like 5% more games or something like that, right? Maybe even more. Whatever that number is, I think bad politics will lose you like double that amount of games because people will just not want to hear you. People will not want to deal with you. People might just straight up not like you anymore if you're politicking in a way that is either disrespectful, which you just shouldn't do, period, or is just like so easy to just discredit when you're saying like, I'm not the threat. And it's like, okay, well, you got Thrasio Seedborn Muse and like 60 mana up. You're probably the threat. Yeah, you're probably the threat. Sure, you don't have Ad Nauseam in your deck, maybe, or Thassa's Oracle Demonic Consultation. That doesn't really matter anymore when you can, counter everything everyone else puts on the stack for the rest of the game while still having up mana to do whatever you want.
That is one of the funniest examples I've seen in such a long time. Is I've seen people like, they're playing like Dawn Wicker Thrasios, and they're like, I'm not the threat. You got to leave me in play, and it's just like there's probably a point in which that is actually true.
Yeah.
And then there's a curve. Once it hits, it just ramps up, and then it's no longer about. It's really tough because you might need them in play, or you might need their engine going to help stop somebody who's presenting maybe a combo after, a win after a win. But then eventually, if you use all your resources to stop them or the person who's like trying to present a win, then ultimately the Thrasios player, they're going to take over more likely. So I see that a lot, and it's just kind of tough. And I think that's just kind of like, where do you really make your decision? That's more of a retrospective thing, in my opinion, because you don't really know what exactly the right answer. So if you play a lot against somebody who plays a lot of Seedborn Muse, Thrasios, those kind of shenanigans, you might already have this thought process of, nope, we got to stop this because this is immediately the issue. This is going to take over. Or if you play against somebody who's always on like Rog Sai, for example, oh, nope, they're just going to turbo ad nauseum no matter what. They're going to just do their thing and we got to stop them, and understanding too that maybe that's just not the case. And I think there's levels to that. And I think that's more than just being commander players. I think that just being a good Magic player in general and just understanding situational game. If you look at sports, especially team sports, situational plays typically are the plays that win the game, are the make or break differences in a game. Because like in football, it's typically like one throw or one play or one defensive stop that shifts the tides of a game. Basketball or whatever sport you want to utilize, that really kind of plays into effect here, in my opinion, just where you're seeing that. And it really matters too. Like all those little things add up, and just having a good understanding of what's going on and kind of a foresight of a gameplay. Understanding, like you said, in reality. So in reality is, if I try to present a win and get stopped, that's okay. That's the game. If I didn't get stopped, I'd win every game, right? Like that. It's supposed to happen. But also at the same time, just because I presented a win one turn doesn't mean I should be completely discredited from putting my input on the game. Especially coming from like an ad nauseum deck with like Dockside, people tend to over villainize that person because they're just so gun shy about it. But they're just letting the mid-range player just kind of do their thing. I don't know if you want to get into like specific examples, but I'll give you one from a tournament I played in where it's myself on Corval, Kark Sakashima, Najila, the NBC like turbo style list, and then green, red, Mira. And I understand everybody's like Collector Oof, slam it down. It stops the Corval deck and the Najila deck. And they happen to draw a ton of artifact ramp. And that's like, I understand that. But Kark put a turn 1 Gemstone Caverns in, turn 1 Kark, and then they're hitting all their land drops. We're seeing how it plays out. And it's just like, sure, the Collector Oof is good against us. But at the same time, unless you have actively a way to start navigating towards a win, the Kark Sakashima deck will just win. Sure enough, what happened? It just did. Because we were almost non-factors. Some weird stuff didn't break our way. And then the green-red deck didn't do anything, but just kept playing stacks piece after stacks piece after stacks piece that didn't do any... Like, once Collector Oof's down, there's probably no reason to play a Magus of the Moon. Now you play Magus of the Moon. Now we're definitely out of the game.
Yeah, especially to the mostly red deck that's already taking over.
Yeah, and sure enough, of course, no tutors for Dockside or anything like that. And then if you look at Kark Sakashima, they play quite a bit of basic lands. So they're just getting so far ahead. It's like they're playing stacks themselves at that point. Yeah. And then they get to a point to where they draw a bunch of cards. They get to a point and they can cast a Cyclonic Rift, wipe away the board, and then it's just all null and void. And while I don't want to say that player playing Collector Oof played bad or did the wrong thing, because in their eyes, they saw it was the right play. Understanding how your stacks pieces interact with the rest of the table. Maybe playing the Collector Oof at that moment, that early in the game, wasn't the right play. Maybe allowing the game to develop. Also understanding how your deck plays against the 3 other decks that are at the table too. Knowing where your pressure points are in the game and That's something I don't see talked about a lot. I think maybe Brian Koval talks about, but pressure points in the game is you're understanding kind of like where the deck accelerates or pivots or where its mana constraints in and those type of things. Those pressure points really matter. And then once you understand a deck's pressure points, you can deploy your stacks pieces accordingly based on those things. And I get sometimes you're just trying to maximize mana efficiency and those type of things, but just arbitrarily putting something out there and not understanding how it affects the rest of the table, to me, that's not necessarily bad politicking, but that's also just kind of like, it's almost that in a sense, if that makes sense.
I talked about how politics can start early, but it starts the moment commanders are revealed, really. Like threat assessment and politics starts the moment you see the other 3 decks that you're playing with. This comes up a lot when you have like a deck that's traditionally thought of as like very fast. Like you have Roxai at the table. That starts to change how people mulligan. It starts to change early game decisions because they immediately will, instead of just saying like, okay, well, how do I get ahead? They're thinking, okay, well, how do I stop Roxai or whatever the deck is? And so you kind of immediately are pulling from your knowledge of matchups, how your deck does into certain matchups and like in certain seed orders for your early decisions in ways that you wouldn't already. And that's already sort of like a political game, right? It definitely incentivizes like you need matchup knowledge for a lot of these concepts to matter in a meaningful way, for you to be thinking about like threat assessment, politicking, to some extent already have like a pretty good grasp of the game, I think, to be able to like really say like that was bad, this was a bad decision, that was a good decision. Going into like the example you said, that player that was, it might be bad in the moment for the other players, but for them that was like potentially a learning experience where they got that matchup understanding. Like the people you're playing against are going to be coming from all different perspectives, like especially, the people we talk to. There are a lot of newer players that are watching this.
Right.
And so the only way you're going to get real matchup knowledge is doing bad plays into certain matchups where you say like, oh, wow, this was terrible. So like an example I had that was like really jarring and just sucked. It was so miserable to play through. Was Najeela goes first. This turn 1 Najeela. Second player, I think plays a Dranith Magistrate, or maybe didn't play anything. I can't remember. I think there were 2 Draniths. I think they did turn 1 Dranith, and then I was like, I think they were blue farm, and I was like, well, I got a Dranith because I had turn 1 Dranith as well. So I did that to shut down blue farm. And then the player going fourth was like, well, they even said this, like, you've all stopped me from playing, so I'm going to stop everybody else from playing. And they did turn 1 Green Sun Zenith for Collector Roof. The problem there is that no one got to do anything, but Najeela was already out. So the threat assessment there was pray that Najeela doesn't beat us to death. And if you don't know the math, Najeela beats you to death without activations very quickly. And that's what happened. We just naturally got beat down by Najeela tokens. And we all died to just Najeela being in play. Understanding that context, like, yeah, it sucks that, because that player was on Selvala. So like the deck is turned off functionally with Dranith in play, the deck is pretty turned off. So yeah, you're in a bad spot. But the deck is also like, it didn't, playing Collector Roof didn't, in that board state with the Najeela player already developed, it didn't advance them into a winning position. More so, it actually made it very hard for them to lose because no one could interact with Najeela because no one had any mana up. We couldn't draw any cards. We couldn't develop things to block Najeela profitably. So like you're gonna do things that can seem good, and a lot of the toughest parts of threat assessment is looking from different perspectives, right? Being able to evaluate the table from around you. And the more like, I guess, mid-range, like the longer your game plan is, I think the more you need to be able to do that. Because if you're kind of just slamming down Nas, like if you're a super dedicated turbo deck, you're going to do a little bit less of that kind of playmaking. But then like the longer you go, I think the more you absolutely have to be able to do that, because there's going to be things that disrupt you. And if you disrupt the table without thinking about it, which we talked about a lot of this in our stacks episode, but this can even include like counterspelling a certain thing, right? Like stopping something that maybe hurts you, but it hurts the other 2 pilots even more than you. Like being able to get that kind of information, I think is really key. And to some extent, just listening to the players of the table that have more experience than you. Always be a little bit cautious if it's the player who's casting the spell, because they will almost always try to argue for the thing that they're trying to do. But understanding different perspectives and knowing like it's okay that you're going to mess some of this stuff up, and try to get like feedback at the end of the game. I think that's going to be like super helpful, is when you make those decisions, like, hey, how much did this card hurt you? How much did this hurt you? And try to get it, because sometimes it's not that apparent, especially if people aren't really talkative at the table.
Yeah, I very much agree with that. Great example for a card, something like that, is just getting feedback at the end of the game. because the information isn't inherently revealed, would be like the 2-drop Lavinia, because you don't know how effective that card is in that game unless somebody's actively saying like it's stopping me from doing X. There was a game where Lavinia came out, and I was pretty excited because I knew exactly how I was going to navigate around the Lavinia, because I had a breach combo set up. So I knew I was going to be able to like breach grinding station through it. So when I was able to just play Dosen for free, like not for free, but cast it, and knowing that nobody could force a will it, and it's already hard enough to counter as it is, but Lavinia in that turn acted like a stacks piece for me. And it was like really sweet.
Yeah.
But those type of things of just getting feedback on your cards, like, hey, should I have like done this for, what do you think? I think some great examples is also just playing more responsible and just understanding your role of your deck. So if you play something like Blue Farm, you'll hear Brian Koval talk about this a lot. Brian Koval will make the responsible play. And like they will tutor for a Swords to Plowshare to kill a threat on the battlefield, because they're not trying to win they don't want to lose the game to this card. So if it's something like Winota, for example, they're like Brian specifically said, I will tutor for Swords to Plowshare to kill that card, because I'm going to be responsible, because I'm going to trust my deck to navigate and do what the deck's supposed to do and draw out of the rest of the situations. And that just comes from years of Magic experience of not being hyper fixated on winning the game, but not losing the game. And then going through different like patterns and understanding what your deck can do to like pull you back into the game or ahead. It's not inherently putting you behind. Like people act like, we use this one tutor for a removal spell and it's just like, it's over, right?
Yeah.
Our decks are chock full of tutors, especially like 3 to 4 color good stuff. Decks all have sorts of tutors. And sometimes you don't get there because your deck just doesn't piece it together, or you don't get your draw engine online, or somebody stops you. But that shouldn't still take away from what your deck can do and what it's supposed to do, and if it's built that way. So still making good decisions on like threat assessments and removing threat pieces is like, I think it's really valuable. Like we played a game, for example, and it really backfired. There was like a memory jar on the stack, and I knew basically 3 other players pitching their hands, at the end of turn, especially because we're like mostly tapped out. So I had a play where I could have tutored for a dockside. Instead, I chose to get the removal spell because I thought killing your Dalthy Voidwalker was more valuable than necessarily me putting a dockside into play, because who knows? I might not even get to another turn with the way the games were going. So I tutored for the Lightning Bolt off of a Vampiric Tutor to kill the Dalthy Voidwalker, because I know we're going to pitch the 7 cards we draw off the memory jar at the end of turn, and they're all going to go into the Dalthy zone. So even though it backfired and you deflecting swat in my Lightning Bolt, I still think that's the right play, because the threat to me is Dalthy Voidwalker in your Rog Silas list, which is, pretty incredible. Having a selection of between 18 and 21 cards is utterly ridiculous. I just knew that was the right play. So when someone had a counterspell that could have stopped the lightning bolts, it was pretty frustrating, because I was like, that was really important, because I understand them wanting to get the opposition agent off the battlefield, but because they were so focused on winning, they weren't focused on not losing. And sometimes when that happens, it's a challenge. And, I still think it's the right play to try to kill Dalthy in that regard.
Again, threat assessment is really contextual. So like when Brian Koval talks about how he chooses to be responsible and deal with Winota, it's not because he really likes making sure the other 2 pilots are able to not have to deal with Winota. It's because he doesn't think his deck is going to win when Winota gets to do her thing. So it is him being responsible, because if you'd rather an opponent do it, any day of the week, if you cannot have to use a card and let an opponent use their card and their mana to do it, it's always going to be better. But being able to make those sort of plays and like understanding I need to do this to be able to win, what the threat you're looking down is, how it impacts you, right? So like if if they untap, they win, but you're untapping first and you win, then you don't really have to worry about it. You don't have to play responsible in that situation where I'm going to win first. Their thing isn't a threat to me. Like I played a game the other day where an opponent had a birthing pod that is going to win the game, but I know I'm going to be able to get rid of it and potentially like get my own win before then. And so that is a situation where you don't really have to be responsible. And in that game, I tried to do some cute politicking where I pretended to be responsible with a Chain of Vapor, knowing it would get back to me so I could bounce the Deafening Silence and then Final Fortune and win. So you can sometimes be responsible and like act like you're the table police. But then if it's a person playing Rockside, they're probably trying to sneak in a win. So keep that in mind too. But
you can't trust those players.
Yeah. Like in that game, the game Eric was just talking about, I cracked my Daunty for a silence on top of somebody's ad nauseum, which seems like a cool guy responsible play to do. And so the silence happens, and then I ad nauseum on top of it because everybody just let me silence. So it happens. So sometimes you just get to do broken stuff like that.
Yeah, I was about to pull my hair out in that game too because all the answers were there.
Yeah, no,
And
it's the
then just
same.
nobody was choosing, a particular
Yeah.
player was choosing not to do it. John, I'm calling you out.
Yeah.
I mean, I understand too. Opposition agent is a powerful card to deal with and whatnot, but at the same time, it was like I know what happens with when Rogsai has access to that many cards in the Dalthy zone. Now, hey,
Yeah.
if they were going to untap, if they were going to kill the Dalthy on their turn,
Yeah.
that's a whole nother subject.
Mhm.
But also too, it doesn't at that point it was pretty fruitless because even then it had like a instant speed tutor underneath it. So it was
Yeah.
gonna get value no matter what.
One thing that I think helps with a lot of this stuff, especially like if you're trying to make plays that for the most part help the table, I think it's really good to talk through those plays that you're going to do and make it known. I'm going to cast the Worldly Tutor. I'm not getting Dockside. I'm getting a Reclamation save to deal with the Rhystic save. Whatever it is. Like if you're making a play that other people want to have happen, you should make that known, especially if you're casting something scary to do. Like if you cast a Vampiric Tutor and you don't say, this is getting Cyclonic Rift to deal with whatever, this guy. People are going to naturally be kind of spooked when they see a Vamp Tutor hit the stack. So they might be likely to mental misstep you, even though what you're doing is actually trying to help them. So you definitely want to make that kind of stuff known. And it also can help you. Players might also be incentivized to kind of protect what you're doing when they do that, right? So if someone tries to force of will, whatever, your tutor or something, you might be able to get some backup because they know it's going to be directed at the player who's currently winning the game.
It's really, really, really good observation. And so what's interesting about like threat assessment and politicking is I think they just go hand in hand. They just layer because typically part of the politicking is the threat assessment.
Yeah.
Because that's what they're really politicking about. And just understanding that losing a game, first off, before we continue, you can't put your identity in your win and loss record. You just throw that in the trash. Because first off, that's not really why we play Commander. I mean, it might be for some people. I don't play Commander for that. I play Commander mostly to be social with my friends. It allows me to play super sweet cards that I've owned. It allows me to also kind of itch that collector inside me a little bit as I go because I like to foil Japanese out my deck as much as possible, little by little. It makes this really cool quest to like build this deck. From 2019, I've started with Corvold. That is my main deck. I have Blue Farm, Rocksai, all these other decks I can build or have build, or Rocco, or you name it. They're all together. But I do play those decks from time to time just to make sure I get enough reps to understand what those decks do and everything like that. But that's why I play Commander for various reasons. So that's, to me, now it's more so getting better as a player, understanding the deck as like an archetype. Also, it's place in the meta. Can I shape and mold this deck to, play and be up to par with some of these other decks? And while it's not as powerful as some of these other decks, that's like the goal. So it's like a puzzle. If you've ever looked at my primer or go to my Mox field, my deck is typically always updated because I'm always like shifting and moving 3 to 4 cards at a time based on what I see from tournament to tournament. So people get like really torn up about, I think, wins and losses. And it's really frustrating too if you go on a losing streak and it's tough. I think it's more tough when your decision making is the reason why you're losing. I think that's probably the most frustrating thing is like if someone Thassa's Oracle combos me turn 2, I'm John. I only have one card that could technically do anything about it. So they got me. That's kind of the dice I roll. But also at the same time, if this person who mulliganed down the 4 opens up with a Rhystic Study and we all can play responsibly around the Rhystic Study and they choose not to, and we in turn lose to said thing, that's where the frustration really comes in. And that's where it's good to have an open discussion at the end of the game, especially if it's people you're comfortable with and and you try not to come off as like salty, but also at the same time, do you understand why like we discussed about like, maybe playing a little bit more responsible, paying for your, not just arbitrarily pushing a talisman into play when you didn't really need the mana anyways, which draws cards. Those kind of conversations, and just be very open and honest about it and just be like, yeah, this is what I was thinking, and just have good conversation. Just lay it out there because ultimately this is a very social game. And I think when you're not social, I think you leave a lot of equity on the table.
Yeah, absolutely. It really is a game that rewards those sort of things because it's, to me, it will always fit that category of a social game because the things you say outside of your game actions influence what's going to happen. Like the plays that get made are based on things that not even stuff you're necessarily aware of. Just like if you're playing in person, especially just like your body language, the way you're talking to people, all sorts of little factors go into the decisions that end up getting made. I think this segues really well into some of the comment questions we had about this. Yeah, I asked specifically, what political or threat assessment mistakes do you see people make the most in cEDH? And we got some good ones. Some of the most surprising ones, I think, were about Ristic Study, particularly. We had I Am Tuna Fish say, refusing to contest a very early Ristic and allowing that owner to sculpt the nut. I think that is, yeah, that is always wrong, I think. Unless no, I don't even think if you're going for a turn 1 win, you let the Ristic happen because like the amount of interaction that's likely, like, because you're probably drawing someone like 2 to 3 cards going for a turn 1 win. I think you almost always, barring some very extreme circumstances, have to contest an early Ristic whatever way that you can, because I think it's a spell that wins the game.
Yeah. The only time that I could see that card not getting stopped or it shouldn't get stopped is, I'm trying to think of, I'm sure there's a deck that doesn't win very fast out there that's just it's legitimately just like there to like draw and filter cards, and not filter cards but just draw cards. If it's like a deck that I'm not really scared, or if I know I'm going to play like something active to like stop them, like a turn 1 defense grid, then I really don't care about the heuristic study, and I'd rather save the counter spell at that point to protect my defense grid if I'm going to try to win that turn. It's a little bit different, but maybe some of the slower decks that where you just need the interaction and they're like so far out. Like if Najeela's like ahead of you and then you've got, maybe Rog side, then you're another deck. You're like, I really need this heuristic study to stay to help fight against these two. Yeah. I can see that scenario. That's more of a judgment call, because then at that point it's like if this person's like, and then especially if they mulligan pretty aggressively for the heuristic study and they're down to like 4 to 5 cards, and maybe their commander doesn't draw cards, which I don't really know of any like huge, like tons of commanders that are blue that aren't inherently impactful in the game. They're all impactful in some way or another. Maybe like even like it would be scary to even leave like Teamer Malcolm to do that, because all they got to do is put Malcolm into play with the Glenhorn Buccaneer.
There's like scenarios. I think turn 1, it's almost always you have to do it. I think there's like some turn 2 scenarios where maybe like Rog side develops a ton of mana and then someone casts like an op agent, and then you literally see them like mystical tutor for ad nauseum in response to the op agent. Then it's like, okay, anybody who tries to cast a Ristic is just like you have to, because sure, the Rog side player still probably gets there, but they're still probably casting a good bit of spells to get out the mana, or like they're likely to have to tutor still for at least one piece. So like any kind of ways you can like mess with them with potentially somebody drawing something is fine, but like it's going to be pretty niche scenarios. And it is like in the mid game, I think, is where it comes up more, where it's like there are discussions to be had where there's a lot of unknown information. There's been maybe like some vamp tutors or demonic tutors cast, and people who have a lot of mana up, and somebody like a mid-range of your player who doesn't seem likely to win, like a Kinnan deck, like something that can't really like, A plus B super easily, right? Doesn't have a lot of tutors. Maybe tries to put like a Ristic into play at some point in the mid game, especially if you know something scary is happening, like somebody tutored for Thoracle or something. It's going to be hard to like say that you absolutely should force of will that when it doesn't win the game, and there are cards on the table that win the game, but that's still mostly like a mid to late game kind of decision. But where Ristic does have a tendency to fall off in games that go very, very long, where sometimes someone casting a Ristic doesn't even really matter. Someone can just win by paying for it anyways. Somebody turn 1 Ristics though, unless the card in your hand literally like Pact of Negation, you should probably counter it. So yeah, I think somebody else brought that up too, where I think it's Payday Yo said, not destroying a Ristic study, believe it or not, because they would rather save it for a breach. It was a turn 1 Ristic. I don't think that plays ever right. I know unknown information can be scary, but a known Ristic study is very, very scary. That's a card that wins games maybe more often than Underworld Breach. I don't know the statistics on that, but that's a pretty good one.
It gets you to your breach, and that's why you know, when you have a card like Ristic Study or Remora, to some regards Esper Sentinel, but like especially like for this particular one, like Ristic Study, the Ristic Study is going to get you to the Underworld Breach. That's what makes the Breach really scary, because now they have like they're flush with cards. They have so many resources to develop and put them there in a position to not only present a breach but protect it as well. That's where Ristic Study is, that insane bridge card that gets you there, and it's high roll potential early in the game. So that, like, it's not unplayable late. Obviously, it's blue, so it has like certain fail safe like mechanisms built into the card being blue, like pitching to like force and force negation. I know that's typically something you don't see. I'm just saying that there's just
sometimes
like,
you got to do it.
I think it's easily one of the best cards in the format. I don't think that's even debatable. You got to stop the Ristic Study. I just think that person's probably used to playing in like pod with like all these like ultra turbo pods, where they're just so scared of breach and they're so sick and tired of seeing breach. Don't just like hyper fixate on that particular situation.
Another thing that got brought up by multiple people was with stacks pieces. This is a big source of frustration for stacks players. Tyler Craig on YouTube say getting rid of stacks pieces at the wrong time as a response. And Ken from cEDH, friend of the channel, getting frustrated by stacks, wanting to do something / take a game action, then losing because of that action. And that is definitely a tale as old as time in cEDH, where, you know, player 1 removes player 2's stacks piece, doesn't win the game that turn, and then player 3 wins. It's a big thing for people to get antsy. I get, you know, we're in a really action heavy format where, you know, especially if you're playing a quicker deck, that, you know, you really evaluate the table and say, like, can I win in this board state? Maybe the answer is no, but you have to leverage that information with like, well, can this guy win in this board state? Can this person win? Can they win if I remove this quicker than I can win if I remove this? And that's where it can get more complicated. But just in general, like, you need to have a plan before you just start removing things, because you don't, again, this is some unknown information, but it's safe to say, like, if you're removing a rule of law, it was holding somebody back from casting, you know, X amount of spells. That's pretty much known if people are sitting there with likely pretty big hands because they've been sitting under a rule of law for a while. You definitely want to, you know, have a purpose when you start removing pieces. Don't just get frustrated and want to do the thing. I think especially, I see this a lot with decks that benefit from a slower stacksy position. Like, I think Blue Farm actually plays pretty great into stacks, because you get your dudes out, you get your Tymna, you get your Crom, you're drawing like 7 cards a turn or something stupid. And then you also have, like, even if you're not attacking with Crom, it's like probably the biggest blocker on the board. Things get really stacksy. That can be an issue with Adnaz decks, as they get beat up pretty heavily. And so you want to know that. Like, I played a game on stream the other day where Blue Farm was, in my mind, absolutely way ahead of everybody through this stack style board state, because they just had the most stuff, but they felt like they needed to win. So they like wiped the board and then got interacted with because some of the stacks was up, and then they couldn't win. And then me, the little idiot Rogside player who was after them, was just like, well, there's no more stacks, you know, jam it, try to do something, just like Demonic Tutor, and then just got to win the game in a position that didn't, like, I was just out of the game basically, right? And that can happen a lot. It's key to think about, one, how the stacks is hitting other people, and also two, what actually is what causes you to win the game. And a deck like Blue Farm, what causes them to really win isn't like Breach or Thoracle, it's having way more cards than everybody else to do whatever they want to do when they do decide that it's time to win. I think you don't really need to force the win with a deck like that. Same thing with like Dawnwaker, Thrasius. They don't need to force the win, they stuck at it. Their win cons are all like 3 mana. And so just like get to the point where you can do it, then wipe everything, you know, like that's where like Cyclonic Rift is huge. That's usually how that ends up getting cleaned up. You do an in-step Cyc Rift that you can protect maybe, and then you just do the thing.
Yeah. Just play the waiting game. Be patient. We've talked about this before. Choose your points of when to interact with and when to go for it. And then once you do that, you really give your deck the best chance in those situations. And we've all seen it. I was playing in a game where there was a Collector Oof in play, and I'm like smashing in with Corval, Grim Hireling, Professional Facebreaker on all these other players, and I can kill the Collector Oof. And everyone's like, well, why don't you kill the Collector Oof? And I just didn't feel comfortable winning that turn. Mm-hmm. So I let it go back around because nobody could really do anything. All their mana rocks were shut off, but they had all these cards in hand, which meant they were flush with blue cards ready to stop me. So I just waited till I could get a Grim Hire or a Docin or Defense Grid into play. And then I just played Dockside Extortionist, made an godly amount of treasures because nobody could crack their treasures. And then I just sacked some treasures to the Grim Hireling, took care of the Collector Oof, and the rest was history. So I've benefited literally off the Collector Oof being in play. I still was able to benefit off of a stacks piece that's traditionally bad for my deck. Hence why I also have those cards in my deck to allow me to play through those type of game situations. It was one of those things of just understanding what this stacks piece does, how it's affecting the game, and can your deck pivot through it and take advantage of it. And if it can't, and it's just really getting you down, talk it out with the table. Hey, how bad is this card really affecting you guys right now? Like, if I remove this, do we feel like I'm just going to open somebody up to an easy win? Or that just communicate. Again, social game, have a good conversation. And the worst case scenario is you're wrong. Somebody kind of maneuvers and manipulates in that. And now you kind of gain some new information and understanding too what that's like and maybe how that deck is.
Absolutely. One that was I thought interesting was Wesley on YouTube said wheeling at the wrong time. As
oh, absolutely. I'm ready. Let's fire this one off.
I don't usually think of it as can be a political thing. It's definitely a threat assessment issue. I think it can absolutely be a threat assessment issue because you got to consider what you're getting out of the average random 7 cards on your turn versus what you're giving to the table. You almost don't wheel into a very fast turbo-y pod that is going to, like if you're on blue farm, wheel is almost like you should, unless you've like got a Grand Abosher up and you have a win, you should really think hard about wheeling, especially if everyone's already developed. They're like 2-3 cards. You really need to think about what exactly you're giving out to the table, what you're getting in exchange. There's a lot of discussion about if wheels are good in general. I think they absolutely are for the right decks. So we talked a lot about Rockside today. Rockside loves wheels if you are smart about them. In my experience lately, you don't keep a hand based on a turn 1 wheel because it's not as good as you think most of the time. But like having that as a tool to refill is always good. And there definitely is some threat assessing to do. Do you think it's a political thing or mostly like a threat assessment thing?
So first off, let's talk about the player who's casting the wheel. And we'll just from this particular perspective, because there's only one discard your hand, draw 7 wheel.
Yeah.
And that's Wheel of Fortune. So there's Wheel of Fortune, Windfall, Time Twister, and help me out
Wheel of Misfortune.
Wheel of Misfortune. Okay. So all those wheels are very much different. They're different in very interesting scenarios. So like if I'm a deck that doesn't necessarily utilize Breach and I'm able to dump my hand turn 1, tons of fast mana, and I'm on like seat 1 or seat 2, and let's say seat 1 didn't really do anything. They're just like land, dork, go. Time Twister is probably pretty great, especially if everybody kept a flush 7, because you're not necessarily feeding the graveyard and you're just kind of reshuffling the game. It's a very disrupting play at that. It can be a very disrupting play at that point. Anytime that like I'm like on turns 1 and 2 and I'm on a like any kind of reanimation pieces or graveyard based deck and someone wheels, I'm just like, yes, like I'm like, let's go, because the blue players are about to fight each other with all their new fresh interaction. I'm going to sneak in there with like 1 to 2 pieces of interaction of my own with a reanimation piece on a dock side. And we're just off to the races after that. But joking aside, all those are super contextual. Also, too, understanding Wheel of Misfortune based on the game state and the situation and the players who would or wouldn't want to wheel. And sometimes players don't want to wheel, and then they're just like, cool, draw 7. People forget that on Wheel of Misfortune, one person doesn't wheel, so that sometimes just makes it like a free roll, in certain situations. And Windfall can be a really, really punishing card if someone's like super greedy with like heuristic study and everything, and as they should be. And then you're able to put down Grand Abolisher and you cast a Windfall, and that player has more than 7 cards plus in their hand. And now the whole table gets a fresh opportunity to kind of fight against each other where they might have been out of that game. I'm not really into those kind of plays. I don't like that. I think that there's so many unknown situations that go into that, and I really don't want to put myself in those situations, which is why like I don't personally play a ton of wheels. Even though I'm a graveyard based deck, I just play Wheel of Fortune because I think it's the standard. So when I look at that, wheels are really interesting. Great example. It's Commander. There's 98 to 99 cards in a deck, so there's so many scenarios that are one-offs or whatever like that. But if I'm on seat 2 or 3 and I've had players develop before me and maybe I need to dump my hand and wheel once, great. That's fine. I don't inherently want to do that. But if I can't do anything reasonable with a second wheel, I'm not going to wheel again until absolutely necessary. Because now I'm just basically like player 1 or 2, they've got access to draw, let's say their first 7, their card for their turn, an additional 7, and potentially another 7. And if they're a graveyard deck, they've already seen more cards than anybody. So I just don't like that. I just think it really, really puts, especially if they developed pretty easily turn 1, if they're like land, Soul Ring, Rock into something else like a dork, or heaven forbid a Mystic Remora, I think the wheel is completely off the table at that point. I just don't think, first off, I probably shouldn't have kept the hand where I am in seat 2 or 3 and I desperately need a wheel. And this is taking out like low mulligans, where you're mulliganing down to like 5, 4, and so where that might be just what the cards have. I mean, I don't think there's really many hands that are getting better than like 2 fast pieces of mana, a land, and a wheel for 4 to 5 cards, unless it's a Ristic, again, unless it's Ristic Study, so I think wheels again they're like a tool that's completely misused a lot. Just in my experience of playing the game, I think wheels are just one of those cards that I think there is a skill level to it, because you have to understand. Wheels are pretty interesting. I just think it takes nuance, understanding, and conversation to really play those cards to their maximum efficiency. Outside of silence the board, cast my wheel. Now that's great. That to me is kind of a no-brain play, on that one. So that's why that's why I'm only down to 1 wheel. It's not even a card I want to see in my opening hand.
I think wheels highlight that, and this is true of I think everything we're going to talk about regarding politics and threat assessment. You need to make the play that benefits you the most, like it helps your chances of winning. And sometimes you're going to have players who don't want you to make a play they'll say it's because like it's, this is worse for the table, but really it's worse for them. And you have to be able to kind of like distinguish when they just don't want something to happen because it hurts them more, or when it really is like this was a play that was bad for the table. Like it hurts your own win rate and everybody else's, right? And sometimes you have to make those like really split decisions where it's like, 55-45 or 51-49, where it's like this gives me a slightly better chance to win. And if it doesn't work out, then this other player wins, blah, blah, blah. I mean, if they were going to win, then they're going to win anyways. So, but just keep that in mind that with a lot of these things, if people get wrong about like stack speeds removal or wheeling, sometimes it is like just them being upset that you're making a play that hurts their chances to win, right? And especially with wheels, that can be apparent when you see somebody discard, like Doss's Oracle, Demonic Consultation. Then you can see like, okay, yeah, maybe this wasn't so political after all. You just wanted to win. But that plays into another comment that I got from Bear Claymore, a really big friend of the channel. Make sure to check Bear stuff out. Sylvan Scholars over on Twitch. And he asked how to manage feeling salty and how to manage players that get salty. That can be really tough, especially if you're of someone who gets salty. Managing that can feel almost impossible. Sometimes it isn't, which I think is a thing that knowing that probably helps, because I hear a lot of people I guess this can get as like mental health related as you want it to, but getting angry at something is something to an extent you have more control over than you like to think. Like, and understanding like, to begin with, I am getting salty. That's going to help you from the beginning. Like being able to say like, I am getting more upset about this game that I play than I should. And it's a problem. That's already going to help you in these situations. I deal with it sometimes. I think everybody deals with it to an extent. And some people have different breaking points. Some people, anything bad that happens to them sets them off. The way I like to manage myself getting salty is first just like, it may seem dumb, but doing the like count to 10 or something similar, just giving yourself a break to a moment before you say anything, especially if that's your issue where you get salty and then you do something dumb. Like you say something mean or you, I don't know, throw something or whatever. Like, especially like if you play like League of Legends or any game like Valorant. I mean, I've smashed a monitor to Valorant. Like that's not where you want to be. You don't want to be there. So you're asking someone with a lot of experience with being salty about a game what to do. It always comes from something else. It's almost never just the game itself. Like it's
that's right.
Your anger, it comes after something else that you feel, right? Like you get, when you lose in a game, you don't actually immediately get angry. Like you get sad or disappointed. You feel bad about yourself. Like you blame it on yourself. Like Eric was talking about with you aren't your win rate. Because if you put your own value of yourself into a game, it's very easy to feel bad about yourself. And then if you aren't registering that that's what you're feeling, immediately jump to anger and then think like, when something bad happens, I get angry immediately. Really, there's like a process that you go through, and trying to slow that down, understand what you're feeling is going to help you a lot. You don't want to break a bunch of controllers or monitors. So like slowing that down. Yeah. Because you'll train yourself. And even with saying something mean, you'll train yourself into like your body will think, I get angry, time to do the thing I do. Because if you do that every time, like you jump somebody every time, you're conditioning yourself to like whatever it is, punch a thing, throw a controller. A lot of things that people think of as like cathartic aren't necessarily helpful if they're negative things that you're training yourself to do every time you get upset. So trying to like slow that process down and train yourself, like when I get upset, take a minute, think about what's happening. Is it really a big deal? If it involves playing Magic the Gathering, probably not something to get upset about. And just kind of like slow that process down and just get yourself, feel your feelings in general. Just understand that you're upset, and even having that, like I said, that frame of mind, knowing that right now I'm upset, and if I say something, it might be dumb, so I probably should just kind of refrain. Mute your mic if you have to. Mute your mic and then yell at them if it helps. If you're getting that salty, getting upset, I think it kind of goes into another thing where cEDH can be kind of a naturally upsetting format, because the odds of someone else having like the nuts or whatever is just way higher because you have 3 opponents instead of 1. Like the odds of somebody just, getting lucky and beating you, it just gets way higher because, one, this is just a format with a huge amount of variance and like card quality. The gap in even like good plays can be massive. And so it can feel just like there's just so much randomness that you have no control. And it's because there is so much randomness, you have no control. And so like, does it make sense to get upset about it? Not really. If you acknowledge that like sometimes you're just screwed and nothing you did mattered. And that's part of the game. And if that's a thing that you don't like about the game, maybe if it's something you can't come to terms with, like you just feel like you're not getting rewarded, it's like getting good at cEDH isn't rewarding for you, maybe you should look at another format. Like I'm not saying like we don't want you here, but if you find that you're having trouble having a good time with cEDH, then maybe looking at a format that has that card pool that's like in more of a 1v1 scenario that's more fair. I don't know if a lot of people would describe Legacy or Vintage as fair formats, but at least they don't have 3 people going against you trying to, where every deck is a combo deck and a control deck. That could just be frustrating because there's never, unless you got like a Grand Abolisher out, and once they print an Otawara, even that's not the case. There's never like a shields down moment in cEDH where you're just like, I know I can go for the win. You can just get blown out by the Otawara or the Endurance or the whatever beside you. Like there's just something there ready to frustrate you, basically. So understanding that that's part of the game and just, going into like make a play knowing that's likely to get hit, especially early plays we talked about with mental misstep. Know that like if you're the first person to try to resolve a fish, if there is a misstep, it's hitting you. So you'll get the reward potentially of I get to be the first one with a fish in play and everyone has to develop under my fish. But also you have the negative thing of like, this might just eat a Force of Will because this is such a impactful card on this game. And I'm the first person trying to do something. So there's a lot of give and take there. Being salty is something that can affect a lot of people differently. And just like in general, it's good advice to try to understand your own emotions and think of your thoughts more actively than just like experiencing things and not understanding why you thought, what was your thought process. All that's just good in general and also makes you better at the game, I think, if you're more self-aware, questioning yourself about your plays and things like that. All of it is just good advice in general, and it can help if you get salty. I think managing salty players is its own thing though. That it's a little bit different.
Yeah. That's gonna matter based on too, like, are you playing with people that you know? Are they your friends or versus like, random people that you play with? So I'm gonna try not to riff too long on this. But I think it's really important, mostly because I used to be a player who used to get like really salty, and you hit it on the head. So for me, playing card games earlier in my childhood was without giving the audience too much backstory. I was super poor growing up, like literally like no money, Goodwill, Salvation Army style stuff, and just surviving. And so like basically scrapping around for cards and like having to like up trade and value trade and kind of snipe trade people. So once I established just a little bit of stuff, for me, playing the game was survival. Like, my parents were divorced. I was by myself a lot. I didn't have any, like, I wasn't around any of my friends after I moved. So playing card games with like winning that tournament and winning the store credit or the cards or whatever it was literally sometimes, and we're talking about being like 13, 14 years old. This isn't go get a job scenario and just having no resources, obviously I'm too young for a vehicle. And basically what I owned was like a few clothes. It was very much like survival of the fittest, no pun intended, except for I didn't have Squeed, a discard to go get value off of it. So a lot of that was embracing that I have to get good at the game to find a way to like make this money, to get $15 so I can, go over to Wendy's and load up on the 99-cent menu, those type of things. And so that kind of became an identity. Now, obviously there's ways around that in hindsight and all this stuff, but you're talking to a kid with no mentorship, no nothing. So I internalized that. That was something that was built. And then I just happened to be pretty decent at Magic, and I was winning a lot and I kept winning. So anytime I didn't win, it was like almost like a personal attack, even though it wasn't. And it was just tough and frustrating. And there was really no casual Magic then. To me, casual Magic was limited, even though that just wasn't the case. Limited was still very competitive, playing against players who happen to always open before mythic rares were a thing, like the most busted rare in the set. And they just seemed to always open those rares in their sealed pools. And it just builds this narrative that creates a neurological feedback loop in your brain. So your receptors, when your body is going through and it's producing like these catecholamines in your brain, like your norepinephrine, endorphins, dopamine, those type of things, you basically create this like false sense of like fight or flight. And so this is, your brain actually does this. I'm using some of my science background in this, but it does this. It's no different than when you're happy. The difference of like happiness and saltiness are sometimes like a hairline fraction of a thought process, or an actual, like I said, a catecholamine like difference. So like your hormones control a lot of it. So understanding why you're getting salty and where the root cause is coming from. Mine came from my childhood. Once I kind of removed that and just understood that it took time to work on it, and I felt like I had more to offer to the game than just being a good player. So once I removed myself from always trying to win and shifted more into teaching and a mentorship and taking a step back from Magic, it actually made me a better Magic player. Then I just felt like the game came more smoothly, it came more inherent. I wasn't forcing things. I made better decisions. I enjoyed playing the game more. I felt like I had way more autonomy over the game. And it's pretty tough talking about it because people who don't take a step back and look at themselves and understand why, and it may not just be saltiness, it could be a different emotion, it could be sadness, understand why you're getting upset or why you're sad about the game, or why it's affecting you, or why it's affecting your relationship with your friends. Do you carry that emotion with you into other things in life? Is it somehow affecting you at your job? Is it affecting you? And if that's the case, then you need to take a step away from the game and understand it is an unhealthy spot for you. And this goes beyond shuffling up 100 cards. This goes into like you as a person. It's a pretty challenging thing. Now we can get into some of the stuff that's really easy. When do you play Magic? So, real great example. I used to play. Probably the most frustrating it would be was I'd worked a super high stress job in the restaurant industry. I very seldom got off on a Friday night, even though I'm supposed to be off at a certain time. Anyone who's working the restaurant industry knows your time off is never your time off. You're always working past when you're supposed to be off. Rushing to an F&M was always tough. So getting to an F&M and not having my sideboard complete, those type of things, not having eaten since probably breakfast because I've been working 12, 16 straight hours, something crazy like that. And then you go in and then, your opponent just gets a good opening hand, you mulligan poorly, it just creates this snowball effect. So understand the environment in which you play Magic. You got to be in a good health space up here, I think, and just overall internally. So very important for any gamer, especially tournament prep, always be hydrated. And it's not just water. I would suggest for people who like sweat a lot, have electrolyte supplements, something like potassium, magnesium, and sodium. This is what I would do. This is not a recommendation. I have to protect myself from all guidelines, even though I'm a sports nutritionist. just understand, the things that you need, having snacks, having good, proper sleep, having good, healthy foods, just keep you going in a tournament, not eating anything crazy. If it's a tournament setting in which you're getting salty, preparing. So like, I believe failing to plan is planning to fail. So having your sideboard guides written out, have everything memorized, those type of things. So when it comes to like cEDH, same thing. It's really hard for me to play Magic during night times. Like I would love to be able to get off work, come home, stream. I can't. I've got work all day. I'm not going to be in the best space because I haven't even got home to unpack anything. So it's not really smart for me to play Magic like that. And it's also not smart for me to play Magic late at night because I wake up at like 4:45, 5 o'clock every day. I'm an early riser. So I'm not going to put maybe once in a blue moon, but I'm not going to put myself in those situations. So just understand that, especially if it's cEDH and it's competitive and you're really trying to prepare for a tournament. Don't put yourself in poor situations. Understand, take some responsibility as a player. This goes beyond the A, B's, and C's of the cards. This goes beyond casting cards, threat assessment, all that. Right now, you need to threat assess yourself, and you're the problem.
I'm the threat.
So put yourself in really good situations to play Magic. So decompress, go for a walk before you go play. Play with your dog, spend time with your family, whatever that looks like for you, whatever your individual style life, whatever helps you become center, do some reading, listen to some good music, whatever that may be, having great conversation. One thing I love about doing this podcast with Matt is we always have like pre-conversation. It allows our brains to kind of go versus just jumping right into the podcast. Take some time, really do what's best for you so you can have the most fun available. And, this isn't like if you just happen to get an opportunity to play some Magic occasionally, take advantage of it, but just don't like rush in and expect anything. And expectations. I think expectations kill people a lot. Like my deck is supposed to do X, therefore X. If you go in a game for wanting to learn and more of experience, your expectations aren't as high and it rewards you way more. Make the expectation of just making good plays and having good conversations, those type of things. Just having fun. So just knowing to put yourself in those right situations. So I think taking care of yourself physically, mentally, understanding what the game means to you. And if the game is really important to you, and it is for everybody, anybody who's listening to this channel who plays Magic the Gathering, Magic is unlike anything I have ever been a part of in my entire life. And I've played tons of card games to virtually their highest levels of whether it's national, worlds, whatever. And I've never had a card game, though I do some degree miss old Yu-Gi-Oh, but that's just because I got to cast Dark Arm. I got to play Dark Arm Dragon, which is basically Corvold, in that game. But joking aside, Magic is unlike any other game I've ever played. You can't quit it. It's this creation of its own monster. It's led to some great relationships. Virtually everybody in my wedding is through card games. That was in my wedding. They're my best friends. We have this podcast because of Magic, and we're growing really fast. So keep listening. And we'll keep bringing more content. Buy merch. Spend more on Corvold. Don't buy stack shirts. I'm just joking. Buy all the stack shirts you want because they're not going to do anything. They're just going to sit there and prevent you from winning the game. I don't want to say be an adult. I really hate that term, but just take some responsibility of who you are as a person. Get to know yourself a little bit more. I think that will enhance your gameplay way more. So if you do need to take a step back, if it's taking more than skimming away, take a step back. Play a different deck. Try spice things up. Go play some games to casual. Whatever that may be. Try a different format. Try Oathbreaker.
Yeah, awareness and expectations, I think, are the two big things where, like, if you're someone like Bear, for instance, who is playing, like, at the end of a long day for the most part, I think Bear's mostly, like, getting his kids in bed right before he goes on stream and plays. So, like, full day, you're streaming, for one, which is, like, a diversion of your attention, right? You're trying to keep things entertaining. You're not necessarily, like, making the best plays. So, like, if you're in that situation where you're already tired, you've had all these other things going on, you're thinking about, like, are the kids in bed? All this life stuff is happening. And then also, like, you're mostly trying to be entertaining and inviting and have a good, like, atmosphere that you're playing in. You should definitely have expectations that, like, you can't fully be present on the board state and in your plays that you're making and your decisions because, like, you're not all there. There's a lot of other stuff going on. And so go in with that expectation that, like, I might make some mistakes, and then just, like, understand, like, even just say to yourself beforehand, like, I'm probably going to mess up a little bit. I've got all this other stuff going on. That's okay. And just tell yourself beforehand, if I mess up, that's okay. Awareness that, like, I think a big thing is people can get attached to the thing that makes them salty. The people doing something didn't make you salty. Like, that was your reaction to a legal game action, right? So it was your response that has you upset, so understanding that, unless there is, people are doing something that they're not supposed to be doing or being disrespectful, that's a whole different discussion then, which I guess is part of the like managed players that get salty. I think that can be that could be its own like really tense sort of thing sometimes. I think giving them room to kind of deal with it, whether they will or not, you can't really control what they're gonna do. But just like, if they do something and they're getting upset, maybe give them a second. Or I tend to like to let this happen and then sort of like explain. Sometimes I'll try to like explain the thought process. Like if I make a play that makes someone upset, I'll try to explain the thought process, or like what led to it. Like, well, I did get to draw like 15 cards off this Ristic study. It was pretty likely that I was going to have some kind of interaction. So like, don't say that the moment they get upset usually, because that probably isn't the moment they're most receptive. But especially like after the game or after a little bit of time has passed, just be like, yeah, I think that, like that wasn't the time to go for it because I had so many cards, maybe it would have worked better if you waited, blah, blah, blah. And then just kind of like be real with them for a second. And I think if it's a problem, if it's someone you play with a lot, just let them know that you think it's a problem. Like I played with a friend who I kept getting salty, and he was, new to the game. And he was just like, when you get upset, I really can't have any fun and I don't really want to play. That like, it makes me feel bad about winning. And then that being said to me, that didn't make me upset at him at all. That made me upset with myself. That I was like, well, that is the exact opposite of what I want to have happen. And so that's a problem that I need to address. And so, especially if it's someone you're close to and you're going to play with a lot, that's something to consider. Otherwise, it's maybe like, if it's someone you haven't played with, maybe if it doesn't seem like that's something they want to address, you might just have to avoid that player, unfortunately, which sucks. But, that's part of the game. That's life. That's more of a life and an adult thing. It's just like, sometimes people don't want to change and they don't fix what's going on.
Yeah. And so also too, just to kind of piggyback on what you said, I think once you take care of yourself and you manage yourself and you're able to put yourself in good spaces, and that way you can not only play the game you love and enjoy, but you can also give back to the people that you're playing with, especially if your goal is to build a community and to help people learn and grow, and then within the game space. And some of that bleeds over a lot. A lot of the stuff we talked about has nothing to do with Magic the Gathering. In fact, I would say most of what we just discussed, you can apply to different situations in life. Trust me, both Matt and I have played competitive fighting games before of some variety or another. Like if it was Smash, or, for me, it was like Tekken and all other variety of games. I just resigned the fact that I'm never going to be great at Tekken and I'm never going to like be as good as these people who come in with their special made boxes. So I'll just go with that. Smash is a whole nother subject. A lot of that is some of those games are also too, like some games, not Magic, but games are like almost like saltiness is part of the game. Like there's like a whole culture of like some of these like first person shooter games.
Yeah.
If I ever watched a video of that, like at work, I'd be like, oh my gosh, we're going to get fired. And I'm the boss, some of the stuff that goes in all those games. And I don't put myself in those environments. How about that? I guess that's the best way to say it. Like if you're going to be playing one of those things, just understand the environment you play in. If you're in a really toxic environment, just remove yourself from the environment. That's really my point. You can change two things. You can either change yourself or your environment. That's your choices. So what are you willing to do? What's important to you? So if you're managing salty players all the time, like I know for a fact that like some discords that people don't play in certain discords because of the environment that it is, or it's just the kind of environment they don't want to be in. I don't want to be in a really casual cEDH environment either, like where it's just like everybody's like on their phones in between rounds, and there's time and a place for that type of stuff. That's kind of just hanging out, where it's like more like a game night than it is like, hey, we can have fun, we can talk about our dog or whatever that is, but I still want you to pass priority if you don't have priority, if you don't need it. Like I still want you to play, to like to have in-game actions, be respectful of the clock, because currently right now, like my mindset, and I don't know, I can't speak on yours, Matt, but like I'm prepping for the cookout and potentially the Cash Cards Unlimited event if I could ever get back from Zane. So if Zane happens to watch this, or if anybody can give me a great hotel recommendation, I'm very much have no idea about California in that area. And I still want to play. I still want to have fun, but I still want 90-minute rounds. I still want to have clean decision making. I still want people to talk their plays through to make sure the table understands what they're doing. Those type of things. Pass priority. Don't just sit there. Like if you just sit there and nothing's like, Are you passing? Those type of things. Play in a good environment that's cohesive to what you're trying to accomplish. I guess that's the best way to say it. And then just control what you can control. And then if it's still not an environment that you're happy with, you can either change yourself, change the environment, or both.
Yeah, I think finding people that generally are trying to get like the same thing out of the game as you are is just good for everybody involved. It's good advice, and it can be hard, especially if you're looking to play local. Then your options can be pretty limited. With like Spell Table now, it's a bit easier to try to find like-minded people because the internet's a big place. But yeah, generally, just like if you're being respectful, you're not like, I think some people can, which this definitely isn't Bear at all, so I don't think Bear's doing this. Like some people can have a tendency to like, they do something that gets somebody, like they'll like kind of rub it in, or it'd be like a gotcha moment. Try to avoid, like whenever I do something, I'm just like, cast this, do this. Does it resolve? Blah, blah, blah. Like you either got it or you don't. I'm not worried about like, I'm not trying to get like feel good about myself because I do something at the table against you. It's like, oh, I got you. It's just like sometimes cool stuff gets to happen, but it's I'm not trying to rub it in to anybody. I'm just like, I'm doing the thing. We're here to play the game. I'm gonna play the game. I think for the most part that covers a lot of what we had. We had Jolin plus not politicking enough. I think one person knew most of the talking. That's definitely like something to avoid. If the person that's talking, they kind of like, if there's only one person talking, they're definitely like setting the pace for politics because nobody else is, offering some sort of counter to that. So yeah, politicking, if the rest of this hasn't let you know that it's something you kind of need to do, then yeah, it's something you need to do because you are leaving value on the table if you don't. This is an interesting one where he said that players don't weaponize information enough. I definitely think that can be useful if you know something for like, it could be either something like unknown, like you do a git probe, or op agent, you look at the hand, blah, blah, blah. Some information that you get using that to your advantage, or just like what's present on the board. Sometimes being like, hey, if everyone's arguing over like the spell that's on the stack and you're like, hey, well, there's a birthing pod in play, or like, there's a food chain over there, whatever it is. Like, hey, there's something over here we should probably be focused on over this because I don't think this is going to win the game. Use that information. And again, you can sometimes use that in favor of yourself. Like, look, I'm going to cast this. I think this other person's going to win the game though. And I'm not going to be able to win with this or whatever. Right. So using information definitely going to be helpful in general. If you can just make note, again, like I said earlier, of why you're doing something, if it's going to help the table. This one is something that isn't as political, but is something to be aware of, which was not sequencing tapping mana correctly. And they leave an example of, I saw a YouTube short where someone cast Esper Sentinel with a Mox Diamond instead of their dual land, which signals a bunch of stuff about their hand. So like basically talking about like the information that you give out, you should know that when you tap a certain way, when you do something, one, you should pay attention when your opponents do that because they're telling you something. They're either telling you they have something with this color or blah, 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 or they're telling you that they don't know how to tap their mana correctly, which is also information to get, I guess. But for the most part, assume your opponents are competent and they're whenever they do something, they're telling you something about their game plan. They're doing it for a reason. They fetch for a certain reason. There's information to be gained off of all of these different things. And that's what other really good players will. We mentioned Brian Koval a lot, but I know I've watched a lot of him while he watched Rebel. He'll say like, when your opponents do things, they're telling you something. Pay attention because like there's a reason they fetch this way. There's a reason they do that because they're probably trying to put themselves into some position where that makes sense. They're also making plans,
Right.
But I think for the most part, that was, a pretty good discussion. We talked a lot about the saltiness thing, but I think that a lot of like when you hear somebody say that's bad threat assessment, a lot of that is them being salty. So there's like, it's definitely the politics and the threat assessment and the like emotional response. They're all tied together because the best way to have bad threat assessment is you get angry at a player, right? Like you get mad and you get fixated on this. That's when you start doing things that like king make people because you don't care. You make spite plays because like it's all well and good to say like, yeah, we're in cEDH. We don't do that. But like we're still people and people are still going to have like emotional responses because if you play cEDH period, and especially if you listen to this podcast, you're probably very invested in the game. And when people get really invested, they tend to get, pretty emotional about it. And nowadays people are playing for tournaments and their stakes and their statistics are being put on a website where you can see your name and your win rate. So it's really easy to get fixated on all that stuff and just, understand the level that you can be invested in it and what's healthy and what isn't. Just do your best in general. That's the only, that's the best advice you can follow. Is just get the information you can, try to put yourself in a spot where you can do the smart plays or what you think are the best plays, and then take that information. If it's wrong, learn from it, and then take that into the next game. Know that you aren't your win rate, and also like, when you're trying to improve, and especially, you can't expect to come into a format this complicated and have a good win rate or be making the best plays every time, because there's so much nonsense. Even the best players aren't making the best plays every time because there's just a lot going on.
Yeah. And just understand that we're all humans. We're on this insane like spectrum of emotion, and everybody's going to feel it, even the most like competent players. There's a healthy level of being not upset, but maybe disappointed in your play or the turnout of the game. You can have two things can be true. You can understand that you're here to have fun, but you can also be disappointed too. Because I think if you are playing to win, because typically there's a winner or a draw, which in tournament play is way better, right, than a loss. You don't necessarily have to be mad. You're not going to be mad at any of the players. You could be upset at the situation or mad at the situation, because if you don't have at least some level of want in the game, especially in tournament play, I just think that level is what separates the really good players and the players who do win and the players who don't win that are also very good. Is you got to have a little bit of that fire in the belly, so to speak. That's going to kind of put you a little bit over. It's going to probably make you be a little bit more in tune with the politicking and understanding threat assessment, and maybe coercing the table into a particular situation, whether it's good for you or good for the table, as long as it still has a positive effect for you or outlook for you. So I think that really matters. I think having just a little bit of competitive edge, I harken back to sports or anything like that, but players who have a slightly more competitive edge than that, they're the winners. Like, I mean, you look at history in sports across the board, I don't really think that there are a lot of good losers that end up winning.
Yeah.
So I just think that there needs to be a healthy balance of both, and just understanding how to say certain things, how to cross the line, because, we see a lot of like fieriness and competitiveness in that. And you almost can feel it in games, even though you might be watching on like Twitch or YouTube or whatever. It's almost palpable too. And watching like those final four pods and then the top four and all that, you can feel some of that intensity. So, and I think there's certain good players that do that. They kind of bring a little bit of that, especially when it comes to in-person play. Yeah. Digital play or spell table, it's kind of hard to tell, because you don't get to see the player's face. You're not getting to see their human response. They might say something that you might think that's a little odd, or maybe it's a little snarky or whatever. But in reality, like their face could be, their face tells the story, so just kind of understand that. I understand, like we talk about creating a very open environment, but in regards to tournament play, I think you do need to have a little bit of element of being somewhat a small savage, like a little bit of savagery that's not negative. I think there's a fine line to toe with that. And I just think that's where our game really lacks is people being honest with themselves. Like, hell yeah, I want to win, like that's why I'm playing, I can still have fun and do all these other things and create a great community and have lots of people that I love interacting with and all that. But yeah, I would love to win the game and get better, because if I'm winning and getting better, now I'm not just, winning and being a donkey, but like I'm trying to win and get better, that's the whole point, because you do want to start seeing those win percentages increase.
Yeah, you want results.
Really, you don't want to necessarily just lose 100 straight games and go, yeah, I'm in it for the fun. Well, that's going to be really hard for anybody, no matter good or bad. So you want to see your rate of play of average increase. I guess that's the best way to say it. You want to see some things that you were maybe not as good at, or better game in time decisions, or executing like a combo play, or working through your ad nauseum lines, or like a pod line or something like that. You want to see that improve over time. You really definitely want to that. So you can still have all the fun, do all that, a very honorable competitor, but at the same time, you still want to, you want to win.
You want to be able to like enjoy a game where you lost, but you don't necessarily want to enjoy losing. Like you don't want to stay there, and you don't want to, having a drive to win, because that is also like, if you have four people sitting at a table and nobody wants to win, there's not really any tension there's nothing that you're doing really matters anymore at that point. And you've kind of removed any like incentive to care about what's happening. It's definitely natural to want to win. And again, if you don't want to win, you're not going to be as invested, and you won't be thinking as much, and you won't improve as much, I don't think. Like if you just go in and you're just like, whatever happens, that's cool, but you probably don't expect as many improvements. But then, I think a lot of the people that are looking to improve, they already understand, like they have that. I think if anything, they probably need to tone it down if they think it's a problem. Like if they know they're getting salty too much, they already know it's an issue, I think, right? Like it doesn't really need to be said. If you want to win, the info's out there, try to get good. Just don't be a jerk about it. Just get out there, get your wins, and keep learning cEDH. With all that being said, thank you so much for watching. If you've enjoyed this, let us know in the comments. What do you want us to talk about again? I feel like we could probably do another episode on similar stuff. We could probably talk even longer about this, especially with how much we talked about getting salty as related to it, as a part of it. But yeah, let us know what you want us to talk about next. Merch in the link below over on Teespring. Get all that good Corvold and Agila and Yuriko and all that good stuff. Support on Patreon if you want to get access to episodes earlier, if you want to get shout outs, get in games with us, anything like that. That is going to be it for this episode. Thank you so much for the support. The growth of the podcast has been really awesome, especially the last episode was received super well. And hopefully we can keep bringing more good stuff to you. So thank you so much for watching. Game on.